Hello and welcome to another episode of Law and Order on Trust Television. I am Mardia Umar. So I'm glad that you joined today. You know what they say, health is wealth, and the law cut across every aspect of our life, and health is not an exception. So we'll be talking about your rights as a patient today on the program Law and Order. You know the scenario where they say where your rights end, or when it starts, another person's rights begins, or where it ends, another person's rights begins. Okay. Whatever it is, I just said it. So let's look at the rights of patients. Have you ever imagined that as a patient in Nigeria or anywhere in the world, you have a right? There are informations that should not be disclosed. There are things that, you know, medical practitioners shouldn't do to you as a patient. But if you want to learn more about this, right, who other can I be on the program with, if not a medical lawyer? He has been doing this for as long as I can remember. I've known him fighting for people's rights when it comes to the way patients are being treated in medical facilities and all other rights, human rights, basically. So thank you so much, Barrister Beniza Iguatu, for being on the program today.
Thank you, Media. Good to see you again.
Oh, it's good to see you. It's been a long time, but I'm glad that you are on Law and Order. Now, patients' rights. I've been going through, you know, the patients' rights and what patients' rights are, and then I bumped into the Patients' Bill of Rights. Of course, there are other rights, bill rather, that supports patients being treated the way they should be treated in medical facilities. But take us through the Patients' Bill of Rights, or the rights of patients, basically, in the country.
Okay, the rights of patients. If you want to go by way of definition, let's not be academic here. We would say that patients' rights are those rights that guarantee, first, professional, two, safe healthcare treatment that also respects the rights of and dignity of the patient. So meaning that the treatment you are giving the patient is first professional, two, the treatment is safe, three, the treatment is transparent. Then fourthly, that treatment has respect for the dignity of the person of the patient. So you, as you're treating the patient, you must first of all be a professional. Number two, as a medical professional, you should do no harm to the patient. So that talks about safe treatment. Then number three, the treatment has to be transparent, meaning that you wouldn't be bringing anything unorthodox or unprofessional into that, and where there is need for the patient to have full disclosure of information, the patient should have. So you should carry the patient along in the treatment. Then fourthly, you are supposed to have respect for the dignity of the patient, the person of the patient. Agreed, you are providing treatment, you are saving the patient's life, but that does not also mean that the patient should be disrespected or should suffer verbal or physical abuse in your hand simply because the patient is at your mercy at that moment. So basically, that's what patient's rights is. But when you now talk about Patients' Bill of Rights, in Nigeria, there is the National Health Act, which was promulgated in 2014.
Okay.
Yes, National Health Act, signed into law in 2014, and that act provides for the rights of patients, not just the rights of patients, it governs healthcare service delivery, standard healthcare service delivery in Nigeria. But out of that rights, that National Health Act, what we know today as the Patients' Bill of Rights was extrapolated, was taken out, a listing. Some sections of National Health Act provides for patients' rights. So what they did, the Federal Consumer Protection Council and the Federal Ministry of Health in 2018, yes, just brought out selected rights of the patients from the National Health Act and the other documents, legislations that provide for patients' rights. Because patients' rights, as we have them in Nigeria, we do not have them all in a single document.
And why is that?
Section 4, Chapter 4 of the Constitution, which we generally refer to as the Fundamental Human Rights, a good number of them there provides for patients' rights.
Okay.
When you say right to life, the patient has that right also. So when you say right to the dignity of the human person, the patient has that right. When you talk about right to privacy, the patient has, we may call it right to confidentiality here, and even still privacy on when we talk about patients' rights. When you talk about section 42, talking about freedom from discrimination, the patient equally has that right. Then you now talk about maybe a law like compulsory treatment and care for gun wound victims. You now see that this law was passed to protect a special class of patients, gun wound victims. Now, in that law, section 1 says that a gun wound victim should not be denied treatment with or without
police
reports.
Okay.
So a gun wound victim should be treated whether by private hospital or government hospital with or without police reports. Now let me shock you. Section 2 of that law, Compulsory Treatment and Care of Gun Wound Victims Act 2017, says that a gun wound victim should be treated with or without initial deposit of funds.
This is getting interesting.
We will get to that.
But
I will not divert.
Okay.
But let me. Why I'm saying that, I'm making these points to establish the fact that patients' rights are not in a single document. So, Gun Wound Victim Act provides for patients' rights. The 1999 Constitution provides for patients' rights. The National Health Act provides for patients' rights. The COVID regulation for 2021 provides for patients' rights. In 2020, National Human Rights Commission brought up a regulation that also provides for patients' rights. COVID patients who are receiving COVID care treatment. So you now see when you gather all these rights together.
They are not in a single document.
They are not in a single document. But under the Patient's Bill of Rights, we have about 12 cardinal rights of the patients listed in that document. And that's what we'll be discussing.
All right. If you're just joining us, this is Law and Order. Today, it's all about medical law. When I say medical law, I'm talking about patients' rights. And I'm with Barrister Ebenezer Egwuatu. We'll go for a quick break. We'll be back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Law and Order. We are still in the studio discussing the rights of patients, and with us on the show today is Barrister Ebenezer Egwuatu, a medical lawyer. Most of the time, a lot of people have confused you to be a medical doctor.
You used to be one of them.
Yes, I used to be one of them because you know so much about medicine, what happens in a hospital, and that's because of your line of work. But it's good to have you on the show today once again.
Thank you.
So we started a conversation, you know, it's a lot. You did an overview earlier about the rights of patients, and you did touch the different kind of patients, I would say, the gunshot, gun wound victim, and a patient who is just looking for information or want to receive medical attention in the hospital. So let's streamline it to, you know, just patients getting to the hospital, want to get medical attention. Okay. What are some of these rights that they're entitled to?
Okay, just to run through the list, a rundown so that people will just get to know, not in-depth, exhaustive discussion on each of the rights. Firstly, a patient has a right to information. That's about the first thing that happens when a patient gets to the hospital, except in a case of extreme emergency.
What kind of extreme emergencies are we talking about?
Now, if a patient, let's assume there's an accident victim who is rushed to the hospital. At that point, you are not asking, and he's gasping for life. You are not asking the patient his name. You are not asking him his address. You are not telling him to go and pay money. Do you understand? What you are doing first is to stabilize the patient. Maybe a patient is convulsing seriously. The patient is not even in a position to give you any reasonable information. So your attention should be to arrest that convulsion and stabilize the patient. Is that not? So at that point, you will not be seeking information. But the earliest the patient gets stabilized, you can begin to gather information from the patient.
But does that even happen in our hospitals these days?
It does. We will get to that, right? Because even that not asking the patient for information first and treating the patient is a right. Because the patient, Section 20 of the National Health Act provides that a patient has a right to treatment in emergency situation. And the language of the Act says that a patient should not be received or be denied treatment for any reason in emergency situation. So any reason includes the doctor is not around. Any reason includes go and pay deposit first before you come for treatment. Any reason includes we are on strike. It's extreme. Do you understand? But if you want to go by the language of the Act, the law says a patient should not be refused treatment in emergency situation for any reason. And any reason is any reason you can bring up. Now, some Section 2 says that any hospital or healthcare professional who is found liable of violating Section 1 of subsection 1 of that section, we pay a fine of 100,000 naira or could go to jail for a term not exceeding 6 months. For doing what? For refusing to treat a patient in emergency situation. Do you understand it? So one of the rights a patient has is right to information, and this information is with respect to the nature of the ailments affecting him, the treatment costs, the treatment procedures, the probable side effects. You know, when we were talking about defining the rights of patients, we talked about transparency here. So if the bill, if the thing is going to cost the patient 1 million naira, the patient should know. We will get to that also.
So what, in a case scenario where this disease is a deadly disease and you do not want the patient to know about this, is it maybe in exceptional cases, can you relate that information to maybe the relatives of the patient?
No, it's the patient's information. The patient came, there are treatment procedures, one of which is investigation, diagnosis, what we call tests. You run a test on the patient, you find out what the problem is. You now tell the patient, this is what we found out. For example, cancer is rampant here, if I may say.
These days.
So people go for treatment or they go for examination and they find out that they have cancer. The doctor has been trained on how to communicate this result, though bad, though negative, to the patient. He has been trained. He knows how to communicate that particular information without doing further harm to the patient. Do you understand? So the patient's information belongs to the patient. So you do not run a test on a patient and you now go and inform the patient's relative, except where the patient is a minor or the patient is incapacitated mentally.
Okay, that's an exception.
So we will still come to that.
Okay.
So basically, the patient has a right to information. The patient has a right to treatment in emergency situation. Now, people mistake this right to mean free treatment. No, it does not mean that. What it means is that rather than go through the protocol of the hospital of paying for treatment or making deposits or that, every of that initial protocol is waived for the patient so that the patient's life could be saved. Now, that does not in any way suggest or mean that the patient, after receiving treatment, should go home without paying the hospital. Patients often mistake this. They say, yeah, we have a right to emergency treatment. Yes, you have a right to emergency treatment, which comes with a responsibility of paying after the treatment.
And that's to say that the medical practitioner has a responsibility, and so do the patients as well. Yes,
we will talk about patient's responsibility with time, because wherever there is a right, there is a corresponding responsibility. So the patient has a right to treatment in emergency situation. The patient has a right to confidentiality.
Okay. What kind of confidentiality?
Now, his information is confidential. You do not run a test on a patient And it turns out we have these cases where people engage house helps.
Okay.
And they subject the house helps to run several tests. Sometimes these house helps or nannies are above 18, so meaning they are adults in the eye of the law. They are not minors. So you now run a test on that adult, and rather than give the person his or her test results, you give it to his employer or her employer. Now you have breached that patient's right to confidentiality. So the test results, sometimes they run, and maybe they run HIV tests on a prospective nanny to be employed, and it turns out that the test is positive. So what do? You communicate that to the owner of the test result. In fact, you give the test results to that person. The person will now have the choice of handing the test results to his would-be employers or terminate his quest for employment at that point if he feels, I do not want this information to get out. So you do not go about disseminating information that pertains to a person's health status as a healthcare professional. Even within your colleagues who are not members of your team, you can share information with, healthcare providers. They work in teams when they are attending to a patient. So it's members of that your team that should have that information. But you are maybe a cardiologist. In the course of treating a patient, you discover that this patient is HIV positive for whatever reason. You do not now carry that information. You are a cardiologist. You have your team members attending to. You do not now carry that information to a pediatrician colleague. Yes, the person is a professional colleague, but he is a pediatrician or a gynecologist. You now do not say, okay, I'm a doctor, you are a doctor. I have a patient who I'm treating. His name is XYZ. He's HIV positive. You'll be breaching that right to confidentiality.
Okay, now I have a question. This person I'm talking about right now asked me to ask you this question.
Okay.
And the person is watching right now.
Okay.
Said she was in the hospital. She had fibroid at a very young age, and she was in the hospital. It was time for her to do her normal checkup to see if it's growing or not. And she was in that room, I think the lab room where, the scan takes place. And then a doctor walked in, another doctor was attending to her, and another doctor walked in. And then it was growing. The myomas was everywhere, but she was really young. And at that point in time, the doctor who was attending to her was asking her, how old are you again? And she mentioned she was 25. And the other doctor who walked in now said, what, you are 25 and you have all of this inside your stomach? So in that case, is there any trampling of her rights? Because she felt very bad about it. She told me she didn't say anything at that point, but she felt very bad. And explaining to me, I said, maybe there was something that has to do with infringing on her right, because she felt very bad about it.
Firstly, we need to ascertain who that other doctor that walked in is.
Okay.
Firstly, is he a colleague of the person doing the examination? Are they in the same team? One.
Apparently they work in the same hospital.
Yes.
But not so sure if they are on the same team.
That's why I said we need to ascertain. And it's only the person who was doing the primary investigation, the doctor that was conducting the test himself, that could give us this information, or the hospital. Now, if they are in the same team, his presence there is not an issue, but his comments might be unprofessional.
Okay.
Do you understand? There are two different things. Now, if he is not in the same team and he is there, he's not supposed to be there. Now, that will be a breach to the patient's rights to privacy. Yes, he's a medical personnel, but he had no business being here. I don't know if you get the distinction. If they are in the same team, meaning that in the absence of this other person who was conducting the test, this other person that worked in could have as well done the test. They are together. It's not an issue. his presence is not an issue. But assuming he just came to visit his professional colleague from a different department.
And he made that statement.
And whether he made that statement or not, let's talk about his presence there first. Do you understand? The patient has a right to privacy. Now, what it means is that you protect the dignity of the patient. If you go to a hospital ward sometimes, or large, big halls, wards, you see them having something like screens, blue light curtain, green light curtain, depending on different colors, to cover the patient in his bed or her bed. What they are doing is they are respecting that right to privacy. The patient has a right to privacy. Do you understand? So a person who has no business being there shouldn't be there at that time. So whether the person who came in first is a medical doctor, a professional colleague, but if that person is in a different department, he had no business being there to start with. Let's now assume that he is working with this person, they are in the same department, they are supposed to even do that work together. And he says, he makes that comment. You are 25 years and you have all this in your system or whatever. Now, the lady in question didn't import those things into her system. Nobody deliberately brings sickness on his or herself. Nobody does that. So we can be bringing this under respect for dignity of the person. There's what we call dignified care when we talk about rights to dignity of human person.
Has her right been violated in any way?
Yes, her right has been violated because she told you she felt bad.
Yes, she felt very bad.
Now that affected her person. When we talk about right to dignity, we will now be talking about abuse, verbal abuse. We'll now be talking about physical abuse.
Emotional abuse.
Do you understand? So the doctor may not have meant to harm the patient. The doctor could have exclaimed, maybe by his knowledge of medicine, that thing he saw should happen in people from 40 years, 50 years, and he's seen it in a 25-year-old lady. But the way he went about expressing that surprise has now affected the patient in question. I don't know if you get my explanation.
I'm trying to get it.
So now, assuming, there are illnesses that come with age. When a man is 40 years, they will tell him to begin to look out for certain things or begin to take certain steps to prevent some stuff like prostrates. Now, so the issue here is if the lady, what the doctor saw in her and exclaimed, assuming it should occur in women from 50 years and above, and you are seeing it in a lady half that number of years, 25 years, you should express surprise, you should get worried, but you do not now put the blame on the patient as though the patient
invited all.
You are 25 years and you're having all these things in your system.
It's actually touching.
So it is talking down on the patient. It is disrespecting the dignity of the patient because the patient's sense of self-worth got deflated, even though it is for 1 second. The patient is telling you that she felt bad about what this doctor said to her. So it's not about, okay, if I abuse you now or talk ill about you, it's not about how I feel. It's about the impact of what I said on you. So you are the one who could better express the effect of my action on your person. I could say something to you that is supposed to be hurtful and you laugh about it and you go your way.
Yes.
And you say the same thing to another person and the person reacts differently. So I will not now justify my action because I said it to Madia and she laughed about it. So you, Madam B, why should you be angry about it?
That's really, really heartbreaking, and these are some of the things.
So the patient has a right to information, has a right to emergency treatment, has a right to confidentiality, has a right to privacy. The patient has a right to transparent billing, which is, as you're treating the patient, you are telling the patient the cost implication of each treatment. If the patient undergoes a surgery now, let the patient know that this surgery is 200,000. You add it to the patient's bill.
And you let the patient know?
Yes, you let the patient know.
Okay.
As the treatment continues, the patient is infused with blood. You let the patient know that this pint of blood is 10,000. Her bill is now 210,000.
Wow.
You now give the patient injection that costs 500 naira. The patient should know. So at the end of the day, if the bill aggregates to maybe 350,000, the patient is not alarmed.
Exactly.
Because the patient is carried along on the build-up of the bill.
Okay,
so,
but Vanessa, we would like to have you more in the studio, because this is kind of very, very wide when we talk about patients' rights. Like you said, most of these documents are not in just one paper. It's really broad. So we'll continue this conversation next week. But before then, if you have questions for Barrister Ebenezer Iwatu, please do not forget that you can leave your questions on our social media platforms, and just ask any question as relates to medical law or the rights of patients, so he can answer your question next week. But remember, you have rights as a patient, and that's what we've been able to, touch a bit today. But we'll continue with the conversation next week. Thank you again for being on the program.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
So this is where we draw the curtains for this week. We'll see you again on the program, Law and Order. I am Martia Umar. Enjoy the rest of your day.